Well, thank you for joining us here at the Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival to explore planetary perspectives. I'm Cindy Forde, and it's my great pleasure to be presenting with the remarkable Prem Gill, who will begin this session. Prem is a PhD student at Cambridge University. He's heading up the Seals from Space Priority Project with the University of Cambridge and WWF, analysing how remote sensing and machine learning techniques can be used in the study of conservation of Antarctic pack ice seals. And the aim is to develop a novel and reliable model that utilises very high resolution satellite and UAV imagery for dynamic conservation management and planning at regional scales. And Prem has also founded Polar Impact, and that's a network to support, connect and highlight ethnic minorities in polar research. He's working with the Foreign Office to develop a diversity in Antarctic science strategy, and that's to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Antarctica's discovery. Prem has used his research to spearhead multiple projects to attract and retain talent from non-traditional backgrounds within polar and conservation science. And this work spans a range of audiences, from hosting week-long citizen science at AI and ML hackathon events to creating art installations using Antarctic seal sounds to produce grime music. So a really wonderful way of looking and exploring the world differently. I'll then, after Prem's presented his work to us, I'll then give an overview of Planetary, which is an education system that I have the great privilege to be co-developing with an extraordinary group of people. Planetary enables children to understand Earth as an interconnected system and to think systemically, equipping them to be the innovators and entrepreneurs of a better world. But most importantly, we'd like to make sure that there's time for your questions and to share your thoughts and ideas and to learn from each other. So we'll be keeping 25 minutes of this session for discussion with you at the end. So before Prem invites you to view seals from space, can I warm us up to thinking differently and seeing from different perspectives, and thinking about the often unseen yet vital connections in our web of life, with a poem from poet and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. If you have a piece of paper handy for this, you might want to look at it. Just a blank sheet will do. If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper inter-are. Interbeing is a word that is not in the dictionary yet, but if we combine the prefix inter with the verb to be, we have a new verb, interbe. If we look into the sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see that the sunshine is in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. And so we know that the sunshine is also in the sheet of paper. The sheet of the paper and the sunshine inter-are. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. We see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we see that without all of these things, the sheet of paper cannot exist. Looking even more deeply, we can see that we are in it too. This isn't difficult to see because when we look at a sheet of paper, the sheet of paper is part of our perception. Your mind is in here and mine also. So we can say that everything is here in this sheet of paper. You cannot point out one thing that is not here: time, space, the earth, the rain, the minerals in the soil, the sunshine, the cloud, the river, the heat. Everything coexists with this sheet of paper. As thin as this sheet of paper is, it contains everything in the universe. So, Prem, your work is all about connecting with the unseen and making the hidden visible. Can I hand over to you then to explore this with the audience?
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy. That was a very beautiful introduction. I'm worried my presentation is not going to be able to match just your intro, but thank you so much. So what I'm going to do first is attempt to share my screen. So if you could let me know, Cindy, if it comes up all fine. I'm about to attempt to share now. Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. And am I right in thinking that my there's no presenter view, there's no notes or anything, it's just the slides?
It's just the slides.
Okay, perfect. Okay, excellent. So thank you very much for everyone attending.
There is a you can see the presenter notes over the slides, over the main.
Can you? Okay, let me attempt that once more. Okay. Are the presenter notes visible at the minute?
Yes, they are.
That's very annoying.
No, we're good. No, they're back.
Okay. What I'm going to do then is I may just present without the presenter notes and just do it off the top of my dome. Hopefully that'll turn out okay. Let's have a quick look.
I'm absolutely sure it will.
Okay. Okay. How is it at the minute?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm just going to go with this. So thank you so much for coming along to mine and Cindy's session. I'm going to be kicking off with telling you a little bit about seals from space. And I'm going to give you an insight into how we can use seals to get a better understanding of our planet in ways that are not possible just through the normal human perspective. And then also we're going to be looking at how through my Seals from Space project, we can explore how technology is changing to enable scientists to get new perspectives of the planet as a whole, how we're also getting new perspectives in as to regards to who can do science, and how all of that combines together with the overall aim of essentially conducting a conservation science project in which we're able to fully appreciate all the new science and combine different people's perspectives to make sure we convert that science into really strong, adaptable plans for climate change. But before I get into that, I'm just going to do a little pop quiz. So I'm going to be playing some noises. Some of these noises are going to be from my Antarctic seals, and the other noises are going to be from space. And by space, what I mean is in Antarctica, we have a low frequency radio receiver at one of our bases at our weather station. And that picks up naturally emitted radio waves caused by space weather. And we're going to be playing a few different clips from that. And it's sort of your, just try guessing whether it's seal or space. So I'm going to start off. Okay, so what are we thinking? You can post in the chat. You can, getting some responses in the chat, which I can't see with my full screen. But yeah, so that noise, not sure what you're all thinking, but that is actually seal. So that is a Weddell seal pup, so a Bay Weddell seal, so that's pretty easy for our first go. are we thinking for round 2? Seal, space? Round 2 is actually space. So the noise you're listening to now has been dubbed the Dawn Chorus, and this noise is going on, and I'm going to quickly stop it so you can hear. There is no stopping the noise. 1 second. Okay. Fortunately, without my presenter controls, I'm struggling to control the audio, but essentially I'm going to just talk over it. So that is from our Halley base in Antarctica, and that is from our low frequency radio receiver, and that has essentially picked up naturally produced radio waves, which is related to geomagnetic storms, which actually are related to the auroras. So that's very cool that we can hear those, and I'm going to do a final session now. All right, what are we thinking? Seal, space. Okay, so that was a Weddell seal, and I think for a lot of people that is not what they're expecting to come out of an Antarctic seal, especially one that's sat on land. And for a lot of people, when they hear this, they think to themselves, oh, it sounds a bit like a spaceship. It sounds a bit like the Doctor Who opening theme tune. But to me, what I think of when I hear that is grime music. So I grew up listening to grime, a genre of music from East London, and it sounds like the sort of very synthy retro sounds that you get within grime. And I gave this similar presentation before at a place called Digital Catapult alongside some very fancy people at the European Space Agency and different other sort of space agencies within the UK, all looking at how we can use satellites and Earth observation to conduct research. And I did this pop quiz there, and someone said, oh, do you know what? That sounds like it would be great for a techno song. And I ended up thinking to myself, well, actually, why don't we try grime? And now it's ballooned into this whole giant project where we're using VR to essentially transport people to Antarctica with a backdrop of this seal grime music. And we're doing this project to show people the 3 big changes occurring within sort of Antarctic science. One is the big change due to climate change in the Antarctic regions. The other big change is the change due to change in just how we conduct the science through the new technologies available, which I'll go into. And the other change is also just the change in people who are now conducting polar science as it's really diversified over the past 20 years. I'm going to try playing a little sample. Okay, that is my seal grime demo. But yeah, so going to meet. So my name is Prem Gill, and I'm a PhD student at the British Antarctic Survey and with WWF and the University of Cambridge, leading the Seals from Space project. I also work as a researcher on BBC's Frozen Planet 2, and the British Antarctic Survey, where I'm based, is one of the world's leading polar research centres, and I'm part of the Wildlife from Space team. And essentially, we use satellites to study penguins, whales, seals, and albatross. And just to give you an idea into how the use of very high resolution satellite imagery has revolutionized the field of wildlife monitoring, I want you to have a look at the image, which on my screen is the bottom right, that little white image there with a few of those sort of browny, reddy marks. What do you reckon those marks are? The marks you're looking at in the image is actually penguin poop. So my supervisor, Dr. Peter Fretwell, he managed to conduct the first global population census of an animal from space And by using penguin poop, and he managed to count all the emperor penguin colonies, and this led to a doubling of the emperor penguin population estimate. So that just gives you an idea of how how the satellite technology is already revolutionizing this field. But moving on to my interest, I'm really interested in seals. And this began with seeing the world's most rarest seal, which is the Mediterranean monk seal. And at the time when I came across the monk seal, there was only about 400 individuals left. And this is a very shy and solitary species. It gives birth out in coastal sea caves, so it's extremely difficult to spot. At least that's what I thought. But the first time I actually came across the Mediterranean monk seal, I managed to catch it on video, and this is that video. So it was on a sun lounger in Greece, surrounded by British tourists, eating kebabs and swigging beer. And I kind of thought to myself, a bit naively, if this is how easy it is to monitor the world's rarest seal, surely it just gets easier. So then I started looking at the world's most common seal, and it turns out the seals with the largest population size of all the seal groups are the Antarctic seals. And despite being the most numerous of the seals, they are the ones where we really have a poor understanding of their habitat preferences, their true population size, and also what their population trends are. And as the habitat, as the sea ice they live on is going to reduce in the coming decades as a result of climate change, it's really crucial we get an understanding of their relationship to their habitat and a baseline population estimate so we can understand how these seals are going to be impacted by climate change. Now, Antarctic seals, I'm not just interested in monitoring them for the sake of knowing more about Antarctic seals. Antarctic seals are extremely interesting in that if you can monitor Antarctic seals, you can get an idea of the health of the whole Antarctic ecosystem. And this is due to the fact that Antarctic seals are the largest consumers of Antarctic krill, which is a small shrimp-like creature, and it's a species upon which nearly all the predators within the Southern Ocean ecosystem rely on in one way or another. So it's this lifeblood of the Antarctic ecosystem is this Antarctic krill, but monitoring Antarctic krill is extremely difficult. Like I said, it's very small in size, and say during the day when you might want to use satellite techniques or fly planes over to monitor the Antarctic krill within the ocean, they're often at depth within the ocean and they only come up, they typically come up during night. So the sort of solution to that is to monitor the Antarctic seals, who can have the largest consumption of Antarctic krill. And if you can track the changes in the abundance and the distribution of Antarctic seals, you can get an insight into the changes of the underlying krill populations as well. And, you know, krill themselves as lifeblood, they're not only impacted by climate change, they're one of the few species in Antarctica for which we extract for biological resources. So you can actually go down to your local high street and you can pick up omega-3 oil made from Antarctic krill, which is sort of quite stunning when you think about it, that within perhaps an hour walk of anyone in England, there is biological resources from Antarctica on your high street shelves. So this is James Weddell, and he is one of my favorite people. He's a famed polar explorer, and he is someone for whom there are a couple of different things named after, but one of my favorite things is, of course, the Weddell seal that was named after James. And James is quite important in that he was also a bit of a naturalist, and he also sketched the first ever drawing of a Weddell seal, which apparently was drawn in nature. So it was drawn while he was staring at the Weddell seal. So I just want you to keep this image of the Weddell seal in your mind while I go to his sketch. So that's the first ever sketch of a Weddell seal. And the reason I bring this up is because it brings up a very interesting point to do with the perspective we have of a species can be really, really poor if it's based on a few observations. So how do you get over that? You want to have lots and lots of observations. And the best way to do that is through satellite monitoring technology. So to give you a bit of insight into really how I do my research, I use extremely high resolution satellite images which have a 30 centimeter resolution per pixel, which means if you were to leave a laptop out in Antarctica, we would be able to see it from space. So we can see seals, we can see baby seals, and if a seal has just given birth, just after the satellite image is taken, you can even see blood on the sea ice all the way from space. And you can probably see a couple of seals there, and they're quite easy to spot. But there's two issues we typically have when it comes to these satellite images. One is that it's very difficult to tell what's seal or rock, and the other issue is it can be quite difficult to deal with the scale of these images, just being able to spend the hours that's required to go through these fast images and find those Antarctic seals to do those population counts. So as you can see, the scale we're dealing with these images is extremely difficult. And as I mentioned, when you have a group of seals together, it's quite easy to know what's seal or rock. But when a seal is on its own, it can be extremely difficult to tell. So dealing with whether something's a seal or rock, it's quite straightforward what the solution to that is. You get to go to Antarctica and do something called ground truthing, where you go out there and you use thermal and spectral cameras to actually have a look at the way different seals reflect certain wavelengths and how that matches up with your satellite images. And that's pretty straightforward. And it's also quite cool and interesting in that by studying thermal images, we can also get a better insight into the Antarctic seals, because with Antarctic seals, they have something called the mammalian dive reflex, which we do as well. And essentially what that is when Antarctic seals dive, their blood is diverted away from their extremities and they go to their core organs. And there's a chance that that could be shown up in thermal images. So if you were to take a thermal image of an Antarctic seal, which is very high resolution, you may be able to get an insight into whether that seal had just been diving or it had been resting on the sea ice. So in a way, by using this technology, you can get a perspective into what was happening in the past as well with these species. So I mentioned that's the solution when it comes to looking at how to deal with whether something's a seal or a rock. But when it comes to the issue of the scale we're dealing with, we are in a very odd position as conservationists, because typically when it comes to conservation and monitoring species, the big issue is that you don't have enough high resolution images for the species you're trying to monitor. For people who study Antarctic seals, it's actually the opposite. We have so much satellite imagery that it's not possible for one person to go through. So to deal with this and to look into this, I set up a citizen science project and also an AI project where I'm trying to look into whether or not we can use both a citizen science approach and also use machine learning to automate the counting of the seals and the classification of their habitat. And aside from essentially allowing scientists to get new perspectives into basically the status of Antarctic seals and a better ecological understanding of them, I feel this also provided me an opportunity to enable students to have a new perspective of themselves as perhaps polar scientists. So when I set up my citizen science workshop, I tried reaching out to students from underrepresented backgrounds to come along to the British Antarctic Survey. And I really wanted them to see that, look, even though you're not going to the field, but using this satellite technology, there's a chance that you could be doing much more higher impact conservation work than you potentially would be able to do out in the field on your own. And I think the proof of that came about on the final day of this workshop, where my supervisor took over. And while he took over, he got a little bit sort of distracted from his normal routine, I suppose, being in a different office. And just on the off chance, he started looking through some freely available satellite imagery. And he actually ended up discovering brand new emperor penguin colonies. So I think having that experience of those students being in the room while this discovery was made and conducting similar science, I think provided a new perspective for those students as well. And the reason I go on about why it's so important as well to change the perspectives of students as to whether or not they can be scientists and not just having a different perspective of the planet as a scientist is all to do with how we go about adapting to climate change. And very briefly, I just want you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the words Antarctic explorer. It might be perhaps the chap in the middle and perhaps the chap on the right, so that's Amundsen and Scott, but it might not be the chap on the left. So all three of these men conducted Antarctic expeditions at the same time, and the man on the left is Nobu Shirase, who conducted the Japanese expedition to Antarctica, which most people haven't heard of. And I think for a lot of people, when it comes to who can be a polar scientist, they often have a very perhaps narrow view that it's, sepia-toned images might come to mind. But actually, the history of polar science has always been quite diverse. And I think when it comes to really adapting to climate change, to have the most robust and inclusive plans, what we really need is as many people involved as possible when it comes to both leading the research and also leading policy regarding climate change. So that resulted in me setting up something called Polar Impact, which is a network to support minorities in polar research. And it also serves to perhaps expand the traditional image of polar researchers by showcasing the stories of minorities within this community. And there's a whole range of projects we've done, such as, sharing the stories of different polar figures. We also do projects where we send out polar postcards from Antarctica to inner city regions. And on the flip side of those cards, you will have essentially a QR code which will show you the stories of these minority polar explorers, as well as the journey of the postcard to these inner city schools. And I think really, when it comes to the way we do outreach to change the image, we sort of go with these three different approaches when it comes to our outreach, which is we want it to be widely accessible, we want to foster emotional connection, and we want to create a lasting memory. And I'm running a bit low on time, so I'm just going to skip to basically a final thing on our postcard project, which is a letter I received, which was from someone telling me that he is a minority who went down to Antarctica when he was 16 years old. And I was very skeptical of this. And he told me as soon as he went out of school, he went down to Antarctica. And I told him, I was like, well, I'm not quite sure about that. But then he began to send in these amazing images. And I sort of think to myself, if I had seen these images when I was a kid, that would have really given me the perception that I too can be a polar scientist. And I think me and a much more diverse cohort of people would be conducting polar science within the UK right now and being able to inform sort of our climate change strategy. And with that, I am going to pass over to Cindy to talk about Planetary.
Well, thank you so much, Prem. I'm sure there'll be many questions on your fascinating work, so please do put the questions for Prem in the Q&A box as we go through. I'm particularly happy to be presenting with Prem today, as he's someone who has a multi-dimensional worldview and is an innovative pioneer working across art and science to enable young people to also become effective stewards of our planet. As we advance in the ever-pressing search for solutions to our systems crisis, this is clearly a worldview that will be vital to ensuring a world with a future. So how can we raise a generation of young human beings to understand Earth as multidimensionally as an interconnected system, so that they can enjoy a successful future here? Very much the worldview that you can see has presented in the brilliant work that Prem has just shared with us. And these are the questions that we're trying to answer at Planetary. So I also have a little presentation which I'll share with you. It's probably more fun to look at slides, so just bear with me a sec. Here we go. Right, as I said, excuse me, I just have to get to the top here. The question we're trying to ask is, how do we scale education fit for the future in time to make a difference? Sorry, chaps, if you can see that on my screen, I'll move it to the bottom. I think we're all fully aware of the problem. Humans are affecting the controls of the biosphere for the first time in Earth's history. We simply cannot solve this problem with the same thinking that's created it. So unless we can come up with an education system that enables children to think in this integrated way, to think differently, then we won't be able to move forward. But as you can see, there's huge hope that we will get there. We've created these UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have said by 2030, this is the kind of world we want to see. So if that's our ambition, how do we create an education system that answers that leaves no one behind? It's fascinating when you look at how our education system has evolved. It hasn't, excuse me, I'm just going to try to move this because I think it's probably getting in the way of the slides. It hasn't evolved. It's very much in line with the Industrial Revolution, and it has terrifying consequences. The climate systems crisis that we're facing now is not the work of ignorant people. These are people who have been to university. So what we teach human beings determines immensely the kind of world that we get. They find this a shocking statistics. Only 3% of people go to university, but they end up taking up 80% of our leadership positions. So it's absolutely crucial that we now have an education system that matches the questions that we're trying to answer, matches the problems that we're trying to solve. I've used this slide because we have a myth-making machine in a way that informs how we think. And I think you see that very powerfully in Hollywood. And it's quite interesting here. You literally do have cowboys and Indians. Jack Forbes' book, he's a First Nations historian, social commentator. He wrote a superb book called Columbus and Other Cannibals, and it offers us a way of looking at the world differently. I'd very quickly like to read a very short piece from this book, looking at what is civilization. Over and over again, we see European writers ranking as high civilizations, societies with large slave populations, rigid social class systems, unethical or ruthless rulers, and aggressive imperialistic foreign policies. Conversely, societies with no slaves, no distinct social classes, no rules and no imperialism are either regarded as or not worth mentioning, primitive, uncivilized. This weird method of evaluating cultures reaches the ridiculous when we discover European historians of the southern West United States continually exalting the Spaniards as representing civilization, while the democratic, non-aggressive native people are barbarians. The civilized Spanish burn, loot, rape, exploit, deceive, and massacre, but it's always the native defenders who are cast in the role of savages and villains. And perhaps I'm using a very bold example of this, but it's how we are subtly trained to perceive the world that has such a lasting impact. And I think that for a lot of America is really built on that myth, and unless we start telling other stories, we will replicate the systems that we're to consequences of. I think this current system does teach children to conform and not question things, and that exacerbates the problem. And it is shocking that children can go through this whole education system and barely see climate change, mentioned more than 10 times out of over 10,000 lessons. I mean, this is another, a surprising quote that came out a couple of months ago. I think it's important to consider this in the light of Black Lives Matter movement, how little representation there is of other perspectives in the curriculum, in the materials that children use. James Baldwin's superb work, I Am Not Your Negro, talks about the manufacturing of another, because you need this other to have a better than, a superiority over a worldview. There's no such thing as a Negro, he argues. It's something that's been constructed by the society, because you have to put that negative somewhere. So there's so much work that has been done about telling stories differently, but so little of it appears in our national curriculums and in our education systems. I think this Kate Raworth's work is superb. Probably many of you are familiar with it, donut economics. I mean, it does go to the heart of the matter. I think it's Paul Ekin, the environmental economist, who says most of our environmental problems are economic problems, and we still teach economics based on this system that you can extract to extinction, that resources are somehow infinite, but we know we live on a finite planet. The economic, if we continue to teach economics like that in school, we'll replicate the thinking that has caused these problems. So it's cutting through everything. It's history, culture, economics. It's time to reevaluate how we teach our children if we want to solve the problems that we have. If we want to have a successful future, which we all know is possible, this is a superb opportunity to transform. And I think most of our teachers feel that, as you can see from these quotes. I mean, there's a lot of anger there, but I think there's an opportunity to create something very positive. And that moves us on to the superb Buckminster Fuller, who says, you know, we are here to be architects of our future, not its victims. We're here to be stewards of planet Earth and live according to the principles of universe, which is very much what his work's about. So I'll just move through very quickly. This is what is planetary. This is what we're thinking. The first rule of revolution is take over the radio station. There's superb media. We just need to change the messaging. So at Planetary, we're designing, I'm sorry, I'm just having a bit of trouble moving my slides forward. So we're actually creating a multimedia education platform that uses all the brilliant channels that already exist, books, magazines, online, digital, to engage children with a different story of Earth. And the idea is that, that we teach children to care, to share, and to dare. And by caring, you save lives and resources. By sharing, you accelerate this exchange of ideas, collaborative problem solving, and you dare to drive new models of wealth creation and well-being. I think our mission is clear. By 2030, we would like to have children everywhere who are able to relate to Earth as an interconnected system and be the innovators and entrepreneurs of a better world. We've looked at the UNSDGs, and around each of those, we're designing a program of learning using the language. The UNSDGs are our guide, but we're changing the language into things that children find really innovating, really engaging. Something that that invites them to be part of this adventure. Our first series is called How to Fly a Small Planet, because essentially that's what we are here to teach children to do. This is the most exciting time to be alive. We want to move away from this story of gloom and doom and actually allow them to feel that they can be part of designing a future that is possible. The solutions are here. It's mostly about a shift in mindset. And we've begun to create a set of resources. I really want to make sure that we have time for discussion at the end, so I'll just quickly take you through this. We're using things that are interactive. It's as I say, it's a multimedia approach. Yes, there will be print, but there's also an opportunity for hands-on so that children can get a sense of actually being part of, when children learn experientially, is that they have the learning has a different impact. So we've got things that are designed to captivate and intrigue. If you're learning about a marine protected area, then you're likely to be also building one, whether it's in paper or whether it's in actual resources. We're building a community of change makers across the globe. These children in England, you can see them looking at a map of St. Helena. These children here are in St. Helena, and that's their island. They're absolutely thrilled because their island has been used as a learning project, and these children are fascinated because they can connect with the children who are in the project. these children here are in the Maldives. Their project was featured in the magazine as well. So they're delighted. They're actually standing on the beach where they've been doing the ocean conservation work that's in the magazine. So their whole thing is uniting children around the world to feel that they each hold a piece of the puzzle and can collaborate and find the solutions. Trying to make it as easy for teachers as possible by creating lesson plans that they can download and digital learning resources, again, colourful, bright, things that invite you in to be part of this journey of exploration and discovery, and using all the superb media channels that exist. They've created a YouTube channel, wonderful people like Alexandra Cousteau, Ben Fogel. The children go and interview them to get this sense of themselves as activists. They're working alongside change makers. They will be change makers using digital media. That little island that you saw there, that turns into a little game, so people can actually physically, the children can take a dive and explore what's underwater. And Prem gets them there via VR, but we're still on app technology. Hopefully we can get there eventually. And again, there's a fascinating book called Education for Sustainable Development by the UN. Now, what would it look like instead of dumping tons of information on children? You're actually looking at how they learn. So it's this systems thinking, it's anticipatory competency, it's critical thinking, empathy, self-awareness. These are the kinds of learning that we're trying to promote through this approach, and applying that across these 17 domains that have been identified by the UNSDGs. It's not definitive, but it's a very good roadmap for the areas that the children will need to understand to be part of creating the solutions and be part of thinking differently, so we behave very differently towards our beautiful planet. That brings me to the end of the show. I apologise for having the images on the screen. I think it's, as I say, it's really inspiring to be here with Prem, because I think he's very much got this mindset of how you can see the world differently and look at the multi-dimensions that you're able to compute, Prem, that you feel comfortable in. Not only are you doing this amazing work out in the Antarctic, but you're also working with children in inner cities. You're fusing the dimension of science, art, music. So I thought it was a wonderful, almost, if people came out of our schools and universities thinking like you, I think we'd be a very long way forward to solving the challenges that Cambridge Zero is exploring. Most of the solutions are here. It's a question of having the mindset to have the courage, the knowledge of why they need to happen, and also the courage to do that. So I was so delighted to be on this panel with you, and that segues into to our questions. We have some questions in the panel, but just before we go from the audience, just before we go there, Prem, I have a question for you. I'd like to know, when you were growing up, how did you feel about the education system, and where were the barriers? Where did you see the barriers, and how did you find the doorways through to the extraordinary path that you have set out on?
Wow. Well, I mean, before I jump into that question, I just want to say that I already know of your work, of course, but I was blown away by that presentation. And yeah, no, that was incredible. And I already have so many things that are in the back of my mind that mirror so well with how you approach your way of, changing this sort of system. But also, I think for me, a key element is that interactive learning. And I'll come back to that as I answer this question as to why that interactive learning is so key, and the gap I think it fills for a lot of perhaps inner city kids. But yeah, so just to answer that question, I think I'll start off with why the interactive learning point of your resources really stuck out with me. So I think for me and a lot of sort of working class inner city kids, often outdoor recreation isn't something we typically do, because it might just be the case of, number one, you can't afford it, or I think for a lot of young Black and Asian kids, it might be something their parents aren't accustomed to. You know, the idea of just walking almost aimlessly out in nature, it's just a bit of a bizarre concept. And even for myself, you know, I only started really going out to nature and sort of doing sort of nature walks, I think when I was about 21 and 22, and even I found it just a bit awkward to begin with. But I think a big sort of theme I noticed when I was, say, at university level studying marine geography, I noticed a big divide between the students who went on to be conservationists and those who sort of just stopped their journey at that undergraduate degree and sort of didn't venture any further into becoming a scientist. And typically the kids who went on to be the conservationists were the kids who had a bit more of an interactive experience with the world, through perhaps going on holidays to Indonesia or just doing a bit more outdoor recreation, doing stuff like diving and surfing. So they had already sort of been really engaged with the natural world in some way, which really sort of helped passion their research. And I think for me growing up, in some ways, nature being less accessible, luckily for me, in some ways it made it, I almost sort of mysticized the whole thing. And I was playing a lot of Pokemon at the time as a kid. So through playing Pokemon, where you're capturing sort of these animals and going out to find all these animals, it made me sort of view nature in the same sort of mythical way, because I wasn't able to go out and see it, but I sort of knew that somewhere in England there were foxes, there were owls, there were badgers, there were seals. They sort of became equivalent to, I guess, Pokemon to me. So through me doing an interactive thing such as playing Pokemon, weirdly for me, it just helped me want to be a conservationist. And I think your interactive way of doing your teaching will really help students sort of get that personal sort of memory forming connection to the research they do, because it's one thing to read something on another piece of paper and it's another to experience it. So you've done a really sort of beautiful, accessible way of achieving that balance. But then I suppose in terms of barriers, I think the two biggest barriers when it comes to wanting to be especially conservationist, is one is the image of a conservationist or the image of a polar scientist. I think often it's sort of very much, you know, I love David Attenborough, but it is sort of, I think for a lot of people, it's almost seen as a lifestyle where you're quite wealthy and traveling around the world. So even though we love seeing this, it's not something we can aspire to. You know, it's almost as likely to be an astronaut. You know, people become astronauts, you know, people become conservationists, but it's just something that's of another world, not something you can really do. So I think that's where the image comes into it. And of course, that ties in with the wealth. So actually just being able to go out and have access and have a culture where you're more accustomed to going out is something a lot of kids just don't have access to. And that can really sort of impact with just knowing what opportunities exist. And I remember in undergrad, I think a lot of students who were going to university for the first time from these underrepresented working class backgrounds, they really had no clue that you could go abroad and do a conservation project until they had seen other students do it who had known from their friends or families doing it before. And by then it was sort of too late. They were at the end of the pipeline. They had sort of come to the final year of their degree. So they were sort of just shot out the pipeline, and they didn't get to sort of continue on their way up into becoming a conservationist. So yeah, I would say that. And also, you know, this is going to a bit more of a wider issue, but I think just in the UK there can be issues in terms of perhaps from society and teachers themselves with perceptions of who can be a scientist and who can do certain subjects and who can, you know, be well at STEM, and sort of that soft influence from society and education within our sort of structure between who's encouraged to do the STEM subjects and who isn't, essentially.
There's a lot of issues there, Prem, but it does obviously show how important it is to bring multiple perspectives into learning, because I think it's, you know, it's fantastic that you found a way through, but it does show us how telling it is that you had so many hurdles to overcome. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you very much for asking them. The first question has come from Claire. You've said, interesting, how did the students react to your work? Have you seen any impact within those schools? I think obviously measuring impact is really key. You know, beyond the, we've only been in schools for just over a year actually. The children were absolutely delighted and thrilled, and I think the global dimension to it really helped there. Claire, also we did projects where they could not only see each other in the actual projects that are featured in the magazine that you saw there, but we had an art project where we called almost Message in a Bottle, where the children created these their hopes and their dreams for Earth in a bottle shape, and we posted those on an online gallery. So again, children from all around the world could see what each were doing. So the initial impact is very high. The thing is, how do you sustain that? And you can't just go on in a one-off event. You know, we need to make sure that what we're working to do is integrate this into a sustained way of learning, and that that will take time. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for these lovely questions. You've asked, Cindy, to your point on education requires a new way of thinking for us to build a more sustainable future, and this includes social structures. How do you see the recent anti-racism movement in the USA related to this? What is the way forward if economics underline these issues? Well, I'm going to invite you to comment on that also, Prem. I just want to say, I mean, that is in some ways, it is the crux of the issue. I think from some of the things that you've just heard Prem saying, I think children coming to understand themselves as part of the human race rather than part of any particular race is crucial. In the materials that we're designing, we are trying to make sure there's a strong representation of everybody, and not just in the terms of, oh, here's these little brown children in the developing world. It's children as equal, powerful agents of change. So again, that needs to be amplified. What is the way forward if economics underlies these issues? That's a very tricky one. And I think, it's something that I would say takes time. We have got a very short window to make changes. The big question that we're asking is, how do we scale education fit for the future in time to make the difference? So I think, as well as creating resources, there's an advocacy piece that needs to happen, that we do change how economics is taught, because that is the absolute nub of the issue. It's the heart of the beast. So I think we have to do our best to enable children to see things differently, and then advocate for things to be changing at the higher levels in education. Prem, do you have comments on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just to mirror your points there, and the fact that, so much of this is interlinked. A lot of, racism as we know it today sort of is born out of economic interests, really, during imperial times. So the economic factors and the racism factors and all of those structures, they're all tied in so tightly together. So by tackling one, you're often tackling the other at the same time. And essentially, the underlying thing is to really give people, essentially to enable people to be agents of change. And as Cindy mentioned, we want to sort of change the imagery to make sure it's not just a perspective where it's one slither of society that is leading the charge to basically solve these issues and save the whole world, while the other section of society is sort of seen as the victims of the situation. We really want to have it that everyone understands that not only are they capable of it, but also looking at the economic situations, that not only are you capable of making the change, but actually providing the resources for people to be able to pursue their beliefs that they can make these changes and become future leaders in conservation.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree, Prem. We have a question from Wiki. Curriculums are always very full. How much success are you having getting your stuff into schools, e.g. UK and the US? That is a really interesting question. I think in the earlier years, it's much easier to get things in, because there's so much more flexibility about what can be taught. And as I say, we're trying to take a dimensional approach so that this could fit in with science, art, literacy, global interest. When you get to high schools, you get a much more straitjacketed approach to how you're, to what can be taught. However, I think that is changing now. There is more of an appetite coming from the teachers themselves to have these issues taught. And there's a big focus on climate change, but I think we all know that they're interconnected. I think the biggest issue really is getting, as soon as the teachers see that resources are available, they want them. Our issue at the moment is creating them quickly enough to get them out there and actually finding a model, the funding model that enables us to do that, which actually is quite a nice problem to have because it's a much easier one to solve, to be honest. Oh, I notice you have great work. How are you funded? Well, that's a good question. At the moment, we're working in collaboration with people like the Blue Marine Foundation, so that we create the resources with the conservation agencies who are experts in that particular area. And we're looking at collaborations with global educators, which would then give us the reach to get into schools across the world much more quickly. So please watch this space, Wuki.
Yeah, just to sort of add another element to that, I think it is like, so I don't work with schools directly, so I'm not sure with how easy or how difficult it is to get stuff into the curriculum. But I think from my personal experience, there's really effective ways of also just teaching outside of the classroom environment. And I think for sure, when you look at sort of traditional methods of, say, just a Nat Geo magazine or something, or certain books, often, if those aren't in the classroom, it can be up to, say, parents to purchase certain books, which can be really difficult. So it's great that Cindy has resources that are really directed to, curriculums and school resources. But there's a lot of people who are creating resources for children that are only accessible if the parents go out and purchase them. And, if you have a magazine, which is, say, 10 quid, for a lot of working class parents, they might not purchase that. But if you do stuff through other accessible mediums, just online, it might be a higher chance that even if the parents aren't able to make that purchase or even know of these things existing, such as certain magazines or books for 10, 15 quid, if there's a lot of content online, that's something that could be widely sort of digested. And I think for me, just sort of sharing a lot of stuff through just Facebook and Facebook groups, where parents end up sort of taking that and directly showing it to their kids. So I think there's lots of different pathways to educating children outside of the classroom. And I think really, I think some of the biggest ways to change images really is through an interactive space. And I remember for myself, there was great examples to do with video games. I remember there was a World War II video game that came out a few years ago, and they decided to feature basically black and brown soldiers who were part of the British Army, which commonly weren't included in those video games. And this led to a lot of online discussions with, is this actually representative? And people discovered very rapidly that it's that this is the reality. The British Army had lots of soldiers from the Commonwealth fighting in Europe. And, often some of this stuff was taught in the curriculum, it was taught in schools, but it was just taught in a way in which it didn't really stick with people and it didn't really form part of their reality. So again, going back to, that's why I think Cindy's interactive way of teaching is so important, because really it can just be sometimes not so much the content, but how it's delivered.
Well, thanks very, very much indeed, Prem, for sharing this space with me and for all that encouragement. It's a short hour, so we're at the top of the hour now, so we need to bring the presentation to the close. I think the key for me, having shared the platform with you, Prem, and more generally in the work that I'm doing, is collaboration. I think there's many amazing people who are working on this space. It gives us huge hope. I think exponentially we're much stronger. So when we find each other in spaces like this, in spaces like the wonderful Cambridge Zero, who I have to say are being a tremendous support for the work that I'm trying to do, then I think that's how we make forward. It doesn't belong to any single one of us, it belongs to all of us. And I think that's what's so inspiring about spaces like this. You know, thanks very much to Cambridge Zero for hosting the festival, because it means that we can find each other, we can find out about what we're doing, and we can collaborate and grow together. And that goes to the wonderful audience that have joined us today. Thank you so much indeed. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you, and thanks so much for your interest and your support.